grandparents, maybe your great-grandparents, were busy hunting, tilling the earth, building their homes, and doing all the hard work just to survive and thrive on their own land, creating their own destinies. Guess what was happening far, far away, across the ocean, in the grand opulent hall of Berlin? A bunch of stern-faced, the big shots from Europe, Britain, France, Germany, Belgium were there doing. They weren't talking about trade deals that would benefit everyone. Oh no. From late 1884 to early 1885, they were literally hunched over maps, drawing lines with fat pencils, sharing the entire African continent among themselves like it was a giant cake, and we, the people who lived there, were just ingredients. No invitation sent, no voices heard from the land they were carving up, just a bent stroke, and suddenly your ancestral village was now Britain or French or Belgium. Can you even wrap up your head around that? To understand the present, we have to go back. Imagine the late 19th centuries in Africa. Hundreds of distinct kingdoms, empires, and societies existed. The Zulu kingdom in south, the Ashanti Empire in the west, the Buganda kingdom in the east. These were complex societies with their own laws, trade routes, and cultures. But how did these strangers conquer a continent they knew nothing about? Let's break it down to your understanding. They did not just march in, they used a playbook of deception and division. Firstly, they weaponized the local leadership. The colonizers perfected the art of indirect rule. They would find a local chief or king, showing him the gifts and promises of powers, and turn him into a colonial administrator. He would collect taxes from the crown, enforce colonial laws, and suppress dissent amongst his own people. In return, he kept his title and a silver of authority. The colonizers created a buffer, making it seem as though Africa were ruling themselves, when in reality they were puppets on a colonial string. Secondly, they used religion as a tool of pacification. Missionaries often arrived ahead of the soldiers and acted with good intention, building schools and hospitals. The institution of the church was an indispensable part of colonial project. It taught a doctrine of obedience to authority and often framed the colonizers as divinely sent saviors on its civilizing mission. By systematically dismantling traditional spiritual beliefs, they eroded a core part of African identity and resistance. Thirdly, they sold the illusion of progress. They built railways, but where did those railways go? Not from one African village to another to promote local trade. They went from the resource-rich interior straight to the port, creating a one-way conveyor belt to ship Africa's wealth to Europe. They promised a modern world but delivered savagery. They offered protection, but it was the protection racket of the mafia. Protection from the very violence they themselves would inflict if their terms were not met. This was the foundation, a foundation of deceit upon which an empire of exploitation was built. Once the hooks were in, the draining of the continent began in earnest. It was a two-pronged extraction. First, human resources in the Congo Free State, which was not a colony but the personal property of King Leopold II of Belgium. A reign of terror was unleashed to extract rubber. Failure to meet quotas was punished by death. Millions punished in what was a silent holocaust. Africa were also forced to fight in Europe's war. Over 2 million Africans were involved in World War I as soldiers and laborers. They fought and died for the freedom of empires that denied them their own. And then there was the plunder of natural resources, the gold, the diamond, the cocoa, the oil. The entire economic structure of the colonies was focused on a single purpose: extraction. There was no incentive to build local industries, to process the raw materials, or to foster a self-sustaining economy. Why sell finished chocolate bars when you can buy cheap cocoa beans and sell the bars back to the world, and even to Africa, at a massive profit? Africa was locked into the role of the poor supplier of cheap materials. After the Second World War, the world changed. The colonial powers were weakened, and a wave of independence movement swept across Africa, fueled by a generation of educated and determined leaders. Starting in the 1950s, one by one, African nations began to win their political independence. It seems like a triumphant and to a dark chapter. The chains were broken. Freedom was won, but the chains were never truly broken. They just became invisible. This was the dawn of a new, more sophisticated era of control: neo-colonialism.
The man who gave this new monster its name was Scramble And Colonization. In his groundbreaking 1965 book, Neo-Colonialism, the last stage of imperialism, he laid it out with chilling clarity. He wrote that a state can have all the outward trappings of sovereignty: a flag, an anthem, a state at the UN. But if its economic system and political policy are directed from outside, it is not independent. It is a neo-colonial state, and the mechanism of this new control were insidious. One of the most potent was financial control. Take the CFA franc, a currency used by 14 West and Central African nations. It was created by France in 1945. For decades, these nations were required to deposit 50% of their 14 currency reserve into the French treasury. France guaranteed the currency's convertibility, but in exchange, it held immense economic and political leverage over these independent nations. Then came the debt traps. When these new nations needed loans to build their countries, they turned to the World Bank and the IMF. These institutions, largely controlled by Western powers, provided loans with strings attached. These were called Structural Adjustment Programs, or SAPs. They forced African governments to prioritize state-owned assets, slash spending on healthcare and education, and devalue their currencies, all of which made it easier for foreign corporations to buy up African resources on the cheap. It was colonialism by spreadsheet. Finally, there was political manipulation. If an African leader played by the rule, they were supported. But if they dared to challenge the system, they were dealt with. And this brings us to the visionaries. The leaders who saw the neo-colonial trap and dedicated their lives to flying for the true sovereign united Africa. And they paid the ultimate price. Patrice Lumumba of the Congo. At his country's independence ceremony in 1960, instead of giving a political speech, he delivered a fiery indictment of Belgian colonial brutality in front of the Belgian king. He vowed that Congo's immense wealth will now serve the Congolese people. He was a threat to the established order. Within months, he was overthrown and brutally assassinated in a plot involving Belgian and American intelligence agencies. Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana. He was the intellectual father of modern Pan-Africanism, dreaming of a united state of Africa, with a common market, a united military, and a shared foreign policy. He knew that individual, we African nations will be picked off one by one, but a united continent will be a world power. In 1966, while he was on a diplomatic mission to China, he was overthrown in a military coup that the classified CIA document later confirmed they had knowledge of and supported. Thomas Sankara, president of Burkina Faso from 1983 to 1987, known as Africa's Che Guevara, he was a true revolutionary. He changed his country's name from the colonial Upper Volta to Burkina Faso, meaning land of upright people. He launched mass vaccination campaign, fought desertification by planting millions of trees, and championed women's fight in ways that were revolutionary for the time. Most dangerously, he preached self-sufficiency, famously saying, "He who feeds you controls you." He refused to take on more debts from the IMF. In 1987, he was assassinated in a coup led by his best friend, a coup widely believed to have had a foreign backing. And even Muammar Gaddafi of Libya, while his legacy is complex and controversial, in his later years, he became a major proponent of Pan-Africanism. He was pushing for the creation of an African monetary fund and an African investment bank to break the continent's dependency on the IMF and the World Bank. His most audacious plan was for a gold-backed currency, the African dinar, which would have been used to trade oil and other resources, directly challenging the supremacy of the US dollar. In 2011, a NATO-led military intervention, framed as a humanitarian mission, led to his overthrow and death, plunging Libya into chaos and ending the push for the gold-backed dinar. Lumumba, Nkrumah, Sankara, Gaddafi. Do you see the pattern? Every leader who championed genuine economic independence and African unity was overthrown and killed. Their dream of a sovereign, self-reliant Africa was a direct threat to the neo-colonial system. And for decades, it seems their dreams died with them. But a dream deferred does not die. It moulders. And today, in the very region where Thomas Sankara was killed, the embers of his revolution have burst back into flames. A new generation of leaders have risen, and they are not asking for permission.
This is Captain Ibrahim Traoré, interim president of Burkina Faso. He is part of a new crop of military leaders in the Sahel region who have seized power, and their agenda is radical. Along with Mali and Niger, they have formed an alliance of Sahel states, AES. This is not just another regional bloc, it is a direct challenge to the old order. One of their first acts was to expel French troops and ambassadors, ending a military presence that had sidelined for decades. They are reviewing and in some cases cancelling mining contracts with Western corporations, declaring that their nation goals and uranium and other resources must now benefit their own people first. They have created a mutual defense pact, stating that an attack on one of them is an attack on all three, and they are taking steps towards forming a confederation, discussing plans for a common currency and a shared investment bank. The very idea that Kwame Nkrumah, Gaddafi were silenced for promoting. They are turning away from their traditional Western partners and forging new alliances with nations like Russia, Turkey, and Iran. They are not replacing one master with another. They argue they are diversifying their options and assessing their rights to choose their own partners on their own terms. When you listen to Ibrahim Traoré speak, it is like hearing an echo of Thomas Sankara. He talks about food self-sufficiency, about reclaiming their sovereignty, about ending the slave of the neo-colonialism. This is Sankara's legacy reawakening and rearm for the 21st century. Of course, this part is fraught with danger. The AES nation are facing immense pressure, economic sanction, international condemnation, and constant threat of externally backed instability. The Western media often portray these leaders as just another group of military dictators, ignoring the massive popular support they enjoy from a populace that is fed up with decades of foreign interference and failed promises. And the duality of Africa remains. While the Sahel states are charting this new defiance course, many other African leaders remain deeply immersed in the neo-colonialism system, content to manage the poverty of their people in exchange for personal wealth and political stability backed by foreign power. So, where does this leave us? The story of Africa is not finished. It is being written right now. In the state of Niamey, the government offices of Bamako, the villages of Burkina Faso, for over 100 years, a system was put in place to ensure that Africa, the richest continent on earth in terms of natural resource, would remain the poorest in terms of people quality of life. The game was reached, the dice were loaded. So,
Where do we go from here? Will the new defiance wave finally shatter the labyrinth chain of neocolonialism? Will other African nations find the courage to fully reclaim their resources and stand tall on global stage? The future, as always, is unwritten. But once this thing is clear, the current generation of Africa stand on the shoulder of giants like Sankara and Gaddafi are demanding profound change. They are looking around the world, seeing countries like South Korea, Singapore and China, nations that were once colonized and endure immense hardship, now excelling, innovating and striving more than their former colonizers. And they are asking the uncomfortable, yet utterly crucial questions that echoes across generations. Why has Africa, a continent boasting with human potential and imaginable natural wealth, has been left behind? Why is the former colonizers who built empire on its exploitation flourishing, while too many African countries are still grappled with the crushing weight of poverty and instability? It is a question that demands a bold, honest answer. A new generation is absolutely determined to find out. Let me know what you guys think in the comment section. Are we witnessing a true second wave of decolonization, a genuine awakening? Is Africa finally out to fully rise? Drop your thoughts in the comment section. Peace out.